I could just ask that you turn your microphones on mute, please. There's just a couple. Thank you very much. And we are now recording. So yeah, very warm welcome. As I say, if you've not yet kind of told us who you are, what service you're representing, and what's brought you to today's session, if you can kind of pop that in the chat for us, that would be really useful. But to kind of kick things off, very warm welcome to this session, Learning to Work with AI. This is the second of two sessions that have been put on over the past month, all related to kind of working with generative AI. The first of which we ran sort of at the end of January, and again, we will be sort of sharing the slides and recording from that session afterwards as well, if people want to have a look through that. But this one is very much around kind of looking at how AI sort of intersects with the work that we're doing, both kind of individually and collectively. And I'll explain a little bit more about what we're going to cover as part of the session as we move through. So this is me. My name is Chris Webb. I'm Alumni Career Consultant with the Careers and Employability Service. As you can see here, this is me in various AI-generated guises. I did always want to be a cowboy when I was younger, and various other kind of professions through an AI kind of image generation tool that is kind of fairly sort of variety of which you can sort of access online, but produce these kind of slightly strange images. So none of these are exactly me, but all of them are me, and that is the magic of AI. So a little bit about me. And over to my co-host, so my colleague Julie, who's going to be joining us today. So Julie, if you'd like to introduce yourself briefly, that would be great.
Hi, thanks, Chris. So I'm Julie Bidgat from Careers and Employability. I'm one of the career consultants. And as you can see from the pictures, I tried out a little app, an AI app called Remini. I found this quite interesting because on the site, it just says that it makes your photos look clearer. But if you look at the photo on the right, this is the AI adapted version of me. And what's really interesting is it's done all sorts of interesting things. Like if you look at my eyebrows, it looks like I've been and had them done. And then it's like plumps up my face. It's sort of like flattens my nose. And then this, I just found this really interesting from, like, I'm sure at some point, Chris, you'll mention about sort of the values that are already sort of integrated into AI systems. And it just like gives you a little clue as to what's going on in the background here of what like features are valued. It's quite worrying because I guess the other thing is like when it changes your face, and then I guess some people like it sort of opens a can of worms. Anyway, so that's me.
Thanks, Julie. Yeah, no, it's we talked about that a little bit in the last session actually around kind of the almost like those sort of pre-trained values that are in AI systems in terms of the data they've been trained on, the kind of cultural norms, all those sorts of things. So yeah, really interesting to see another sort of representation of that. And just to kind of give a little bit of sort of background, I guess, around what we sort of covered in the first session, this was really around kind of a year of AI. So looking back at that kind of period from sort of November 2022 when ChatGPT was sort of first launched, and then sort of up to kind of where we are now. What does that kind of development look like? So we talked about, you know, the kind of battle, I guess, between the various sort of competing AI tools that are out there on the market, whether that was kind of DALL-E, the image generation side, ChatGPT, the text generation side, bespoke kind of chatbots like HeyPi, so all those sorts of things, and also the kind of recognition that this stuff is changing and adapting all the time. You know, Google just in the past couple of weeks have released their Gemini model, used to be known as Bard, and this is kind of what they're using to sort of compete in terms of both AI tools and as kind of like a search tool, which we'll kind of come on to a little bit later. But the pace at which these things kind of appear in the market, at which they change, is so dizzying. This was kind of part of what we were talking about last time. As Julie mentioned, that idea of sort of values and principles about working with AI was something that we touched on. So we talked about the university's AI principles for staff and students, which we'll come back to a little bit later on. And we also talked about what was kind of in this visual representation in the bottom right corner that was created by AI around what the future potentially could hold in terms of developments in the AI space, what the technology might be used for. And this is something we're going to focus on a little bit more in today's session as well. So in terms of the focus of today's session is learning to work with AI. So we've got kind of four sort of key focus points we're going to be looking at. Going to start by just sort of, I guess, socializing what we mean by generative AI in the workplace. And again, just to kind of come back to that idea of, you know, AI versus generative AI. When we're talking about AI, we're talking about artificial intelligence in all its many forms, which we can kind of come on to. But with generative AI specifically, we're talking about AI where it's kind of producing content such as text, video, that's usually meant to have kind of a human-like approach or interact with human-like language. And those are kind of generated by prompts that the user provides. So these are kind of the type of technology you might have used, things like ChatGPT, for example, or Bing, or any of the kind of different versions of chatbots where you're putting a prompt in and it generates something based on that, whether that's video, image, or text. So that's what we mean when we're talking about generative AI. So that's what we're going to start with, is looking at where is kind of generative AI already being used in the workplace and in industry, and how might that change moving forward. We're then going to move on to talk about test cases. So Julie and I are going to share 2 use cases each in terms of how we've actually been practically using generative AI tools as part of our day-to-day work. We're then going to move on to look at a framework around kind of your relationship with generative AI. So thinking about, as a professional in your industry with the work that you're doing, how do you kind of position yourself in terms of your understanding of AI, your confidence, your competence, and when and where you might choose to use AI as part of your work. And then we're going to kind of finish really with a bit of a takeaway, so something that you can kind of take with you that hopefully will pull all this together, and some thoughts about, you know, what things might look like moving forward in the world of work in relation to this technology. So those are the main things we're going to be covering. But if you've got any kind of questions at any point, feel free to kind of put them in the chat. Feel free to sort of engage in the chat with any thoughts or comments about the topic that we're covering. Last session that we had some really, really good engagement, some really interesting kind of thoughts around what's happening with AI, people's individual experiences and reflections on what they've seen so far. So please do feel free to share that. And just some kind of basic notes really before we get started. So as I've said, if you can share any kind of thoughts and questions in the chat throughout the session, between Julie and I, we'll pick those up. The second thing really to say is, you know, neither of us are experts on generative AI. Very few people are at the moment. It's a very fast moving kind of industry. And unless you've sort of been plugged into it for a number of years, or kind of at the center of some of these technologies, you know, it is moving at an incredibly rapid pace. So we're all sort of, to a point, experimenting with this and learning things as we kind of go along. And with that in mind, you know, there really are no silly questions at all. So if there's kind of anything that we're talking about during the session that you think, I just really don't get that, doesn't really make sense, I'd like to maybe go through that in a bit more detail, let us know, ping it in the chat to us, and we can kind of pick that up as we go through the session. So to start with, I just want to kind of return to something that we did last time, right at the very start of the session, which was just get people's kind of current position in terms of how they're feeling in relation to confidence and kind of competence with AI. So what I'm going to share on screen in a second is a Mentimeter. You'll be able to access this either via phone or laptop by going to menti.com, which I'll show you on screen, so you don't need to remember all of this. There'll also be a QR code if you want to use that as well. And it's just going to give you a very quick survey to kind of score yourself on a scale of how confident you are with AI. So that would be sort of confidence in terms of your understanding of it, understanding of how it works, of the different tools available, and your competence, which is really, I suppose, you know, how comfortable you are using AI tools for different purposes. So there's going to be a kind of scale, and I'd like to sort of score yourself from the sort of not confident to the very confident side of the scale on both the confident side and competent side, and we'll see where people kind of come out. I should point out this is all anonymized, so again, very much just a case of kind of how you're feeling at the moment. So let me just stop sharing. I will move on to the Mentimeter. And Julie, I'd just ask you if you can give me a quick yay or nay when this is on screen. That would be really useful.
Yeah, it's there now.
That's great, fantastic. So hopefully you should see instructions on the screen. So these will lead to menti.com. We're going to be using Mentimeter a few times through the session today. So again, you won't need to kind of get these details again. Once you've tried the website, it will just keep you on there and you can keep flicking between the questions as they come up. As I say, you can well, you can use this on a computer if you want, or you can also use it on a mobile phone. Very much your choice. You can either go to menti.com on the left-hand side and enter the code and it will bring up the quiz, or you can scan the QR code on the right using your phone. And again, it will take you directly to the survey. So what you should see on your screen is this questionnaire here. What is your current position on AI? And again, it is going to ask you to kind of score on a scale, I think, of 1 to 10, I believe, whether you're feeling not confident to very confident, depending on the number. So yeah, we'll give people a couple of minutes to do that. If you're having any issues at all with the Mentimeter, just let us know in the chat. Or alternatively, if you can't get it working at all, feel free to put your thoughts about this in the chat instead. We'll give people a couple of minutes to do this and then we'll see where we're at. Okay, fantastic. So it seems like we've got quite a few people sort of working it already on the Mentimeter. So that's really, really great to see. Confidence-wise, interestingly, kind of slightly higher than the competence side. So maybe sort of the idea of awareness of AI or sort of understanding of it seems to perhaps be a little bit higher across the board than perhaps the actual use of AI, so using kind of the tools practically. And again, I think with both of these averages, we're seeing them perhaps slightly higher than the first session. And again, whether that's sort of indicative of we've got a similar group of people who've attended the first session and perhaps, you know, hopefully things have kind of improved in terms of confidence and competence since then, or if we've got a bit of a mixture of people maybe in terms of experience levels. So again, do feel free to share anything in the chat in terms of, you know, why you feel you've kind of put a particular score down, whether you feel you're generally kind of more confident with it or more competent, and what's caused you to kind of be in that position. But interesting to see at the moment, yeah, we're kind of with the confidence side veering towards maybe that 5.0, so towards that sort of halfway stage, somewhere in the middle. Competence a little bit lower, and hopefully some of the stuff that we're going to talk about today in terms of use of AI tools will help with that side of things. So just wanted to kind of get a sense of where sort of people were at the beginning of the session. So thank you for sharing that. Okay, I'm just going to pull back to our PowerPoint and we'll go from there. Okay, fantastic. So thank you for those of you who kind of shared sort of thoughts on the Mentimeter. Again, do feel free if there's anything coming out of that you'd like to sort of share in the chat, please do as we move through the session. So we're going to start, as I mentioned, talking about kind of generative AI in the workplace. And I just wanted to share this image again from the last session we had, just to kind of really illustrate the quite dizzying array of different AI products that are out there on the market. And this is adapting and it's changing, it's moving on a, if not a day-to-day basis, certainly a week-to-week basis. So already kind of when you look at the products that are out there on the market, you've got stuff that's got very specific use cases. You've got tools like Kick Resume and Prepper that are designed to help people with creating CVs or preparing for interviews. You've got kind of chatbots that have been designed to help people have really what we'd call like an AI assistant. So things like Hey Pi, which I'm going to show you a little bit later on. And then you've got some of the really specific kind of use cases. So apps that are sort of incorporating AI for different types of purposes. So for example, Vimeo, I've got a new system that's coming out which allows you to edit a video simply by putting in text prompts. So you change the transcript and it actually edits those bits out of the video for you. You've got things like Hey Gen, which we're going to talk about in a second, which allows you to kind of create AI generated avatars of yourself or other people in order to kind of create videos. And you've got a variety of other sort of softwares that are now being incorporated into all sorts of different apps or just generally incorporated into technology we use on a day-to-day basis. So Microsoft Copilot, probably the most prominent one, where things like Microsoft Word, PowerPoint, Excel will all have AI functionality built in now. And if people have the enterprise or the business version of Microsoft, they're already using these type of tools already. On top of that, we've also got, you know, a dizzying array of different kind of competing AI tools that do very similar things. So Perplexity is kind of like a search research tool in a similar way to kind of ChatGPT or Google Gemini. But again, each of them have got kind of different strengths and weaknesses. So it's trying to keep up with all of this can be really, really challenging. And to make matters even more complicated, we've recently seen OpenAI open their GPT store, which has given people all sorts of scope to create their own custom chatbots, which we'll talk about a little bit later on. So this is really just to kind of show the speed at which things are developing and the potential implications for the workplace, given just how many tools and applications are really out there. And this is just one example. So this is taken from a recent kind of Sky News segment about the idea of creating virtual AI avatars to help with journalism and news. And I'm just going to reshare this to make sure that you have all got the sound, because it's pretty important to get the sound on this bit. Okay. So this is taken from a recent Sky News segment where they worked with the Hey Gen software to actually create sort of a digital twin of this Sky News presenter. I just want to show you this really short kind of 15-second segment just to show you what this looks like. Bearing in mind, this is very much kind of the technology in its infancy right now.
So just think about how you can keep your house cool.
But, as our experts suggest, these initiatives might not suffice given the projected increases in severity of these heat waves. There's an urgent call for robust policy responses. from climate change adaptation strategies to more funds for community cooling centres during periods of extreme heat. As climate change remains unabated, being prepared is our best line of defence against the blistering onslaught of a hotter future. AI reporter, Sky News.
So that's just a really brief snapshot of one example of this use of kind of HeyGen software, where essentially what they've done is create a script entirely using AI. They've recorded the voice of the TV presenter and their image using the software, and then used it to kind of create a duplicate that they've then been able to kind of insert into a broadcast. So this is kind of, you know, hopefully you can already see there the potential implications for a number of sort of different fields when it comes to video creation, if you're able to simply create a digital twin that can do some of that talking for you and potentially be translated into multiple languages without you having to learn them. So that's just kind of one very recent example.
Well, it's
this is another one that I just wanted to kind of surface as well, just to show you how quickly the technology is moving. So this is taken from Ethan Mollick on LinkedIn. And last year, he kind of rose to prominence by using a sort of either ChatGPT or another AI tool to basically create a full marketing strategy in, I think it was then, under half an hour. Now, this is kind of a more recent experiment he's done where actually he's said, you know what, that was then, this is now. And I'm now looking at, in under 1 minute, can I actually create 5 different documents using 5 different platforms at the same time? So in this example, which you can kind of see through the link if you want to kind of go through it in detail, he actually creates a design concept for a kitchen using a custom ChatGPT bot. He creates a marketing strategy using Bing. He creates a PowerPoint presentation about Tesla using the Copilot feature in Microsoft PowerPoint, and a couple of other things to do with a product launch and a curriculum syllabus for the course he's working on. And he does all of this in under 1 minute. So really worth having a look at this video. It's fascinating to see. And it draws on quite a lot of comments about if these aspects of work are able to be automated or replicated so quickly, what does it potentially mean for our function in the workplace and our value as workers? So it's a really interesting comment thread to kind of read as well. And this sort of leads into what's really happening with generative AI in the workplace at the moment. Is the conversation's kind of moved a little bit over the past year from simply looking at big picture, speculative numbers, how many jobs will be lost to AI, how many jobs created, to the slightly more kind of nuanced take of actually what jobs are going to be exposed to AI. So which kind of job roles might have a significant percentage of the work potentially augmented by AI, or where you might be able to use AI as part of the tasks that you're doing, and which maybe roles are going to be less exposed because perhaps elements of those work doesn't really require AI applications, or it's harder to use AI to replicate some of that work. So this is taken from a report from the Unit for Future Skills at Department for Education. They did a report that came out the back end of last year called The Impact of AI on UK Jobs and Training. And on the left-hand side here, you can see these were the occupations they found were least exposed to AI and large language modeling. So some of the generative AI stuff that we're talking about, text generation, video creation, etc. And you can see a lot of them probably kind of fairly sort of common sense roles where maybe there's a real kind of practical component to them, and the nature of the work can't actually be replicated by AI because of perhaps the physicality of it. Although there is a caveat in there around stuff like, say, warehouse work, forklift truck drivers, where a number of companies such as Meta and OpenAI are starting to invest in robotics linked to AI that will kind of replicate some of those type of job roles. You can then sort of see on the right-hand side, when you look at the occupations most exposed to AI, a lot of the stuff in there quite surprised people when it came out, because it was looking at roles like solicitors, for example, psychologists, management consultants. And the key thing when they're talking about exposure is they're not necessarily saying that your job will be taken by AI, but what they're saying is actually a significant percentage of the work we do could be augmented by AI. We could use AI to undertake aspects of this work. Now, what aspects of this work is very much down to those professionals and down to the technology available. And this is kind of partly what we're going to talk about today. But I think this report is a really useful thing to be aware of in terms of how the conversation is changing about AI in work, moving much more towards that exposure to AI rather than just simple job creation, job displacement type stuff. And so one way I think it's really useful to kind of try and understand the impact of AI in the workplace before we kind of move on to talk about some of those practical use cases is in this kind of sort of 3-tiered sort of diagram. So this idea kind of starting off on a broad level of AI as a trend in itself in the world of work, which I'll talk about a little bit more in a second. AI kind of in industry and how it's changing industries. And then on that individual level, how is AI actually impacting what I do as a worker in my specific role? And I think understanding all three of these is really important, because we know that the technology is going to basically run through so much of what we do as human beings in coming years. And an article that I've kind of included on the PowerPoint, which I'll share with you afterwards, is from kind of Bill Gates, which I think was written sort of back end of last year, around November time. And it was talking about the future of what he describes as AI agents. So these are things that are kind of already out there to an extent. These are essentially kind of autonomous AI tools where you give them an initial prompt, such as, say, booking you a holiday. They are trained on your data, so they have access to your calendar, they have access to maybe previous holidays you've booked through booking.com. And what they do is they go about automating all the different stages you would need to do of booking a holiday, booking flights, blocking out your calendar, making an annual leave request, all those sorts of things. So there are huge implications there when this technology does become more prominent about things like data privacy. You know, how much of your data would you want to share with these kind of tools? How dependent might you become on them? How reliant might you become on them? And all of this kind of ties into some of the stuff Julie mentioned earlier about sort of the values, the ethics of how, when, where, why might we use AI. But certainly kind of over the next 5 years particularly, this type of technology is likely to become more prevalent and is something that we're likely to see in different aspects of the workplace. So yeah, it's really useful to kind of start surfacing some of this stuff now. So breaking down those kind of three different sort of, I guess, parts of the diagram in relation to AI, this idea of kind of AI as a mega trend is a really important thing to be aware of. So when we're kind of talking about mega trends, we're talking about things that are affecting the global economy in different ways in terms of maybe the type of jobs that are being created, the way companies are changing what they do, their values, all these sorts of things. So a couple of other good examples, the push for net zero, for example, or kind of the creation of green jobs, sustainable jobs, something that huge array of companies are kind of committing to, and it's changing what we're seeing in industry in terms of jobs that are being created and things like that. The other one is kind of the use of things like big data, so using kind of huge data sets and using that to make kind of core business decisions based on the data that they have available. So AI is in itself kind of a trend. It's you know, very much kind of a developing industry in its own right. And it's not just changing stuff within the tech sector, but it's changing things across multiple different sectors. But what it's also doing is it's kind of intersecting with other trends as well. So, for example, if we take net zero and kind of sustainability, KLM, the Dutch airline company, are currently using AI to help make their flights more sustainable by essentially kind of analysing the data around how many people tend to order a meal on a flight, and then using that to actually make better estimates about how many meals to bring or prepare. So saving not just kind of the money from that preparation, but also obviously the kind of the energy, there's less food waste, all these kind of sorts of things. So what you'll see with kind of AI is that it will intersect with a lot of these other trends we're talking about in the world of work at the moment. You can also see as well when we're talking about kind of global governments, you know, decisions they're making about stuff such as data privacy, copyright infringement, AI is very much going to be at the centre of that. So if you look back in sort of December and start of January, there was a lot of talk about the EU's Artificial Intelligence Act, which hasn't been kind of ratified yet, but this is basically going to regulate the use of artificial intelligence within the European Union, and obviously kind of countries that partner with the European Union from a business perspective. This includes things like you know, appropriate or inappropriate use cases. So where people might use, say, facial recognition technology, you know, what instances that would be appropriate, what instances it would be inappropriate. It's going to open up a huge can of worms for how that's actually regulated and policed, but is, you know, it's a big kind of talking point at the moment. But actually a lot of the private companies are moving in this direction as well. So Google and some of the other tech companies are currently working to look at a set of standards for the data they use to train AI models. And again, this is going to become a really big talking point, particularly when we talk about data and how people are using that data, you know, to train these kind of AI systems, but also then to actually use it to create content and that could potentially be kind of copyrighted in the future. So that's kind of AI as very much as a big trend. Then when we kind of get down to that industry level, I think, you know, it's really important to note that we're already seeing a huge impact of AI on a variety of industries, but of course actually generating industries in its own right. So one really kind of interesting example of that at the moment is manufacturing of chips, microchips that are needed, or the computer kind of processing units that are needed for basically powering AI technology. And there is a whole industry that I guess is kind of pre-existing there, but is expanding even more. You might have seen in the news recently, Sam Altman, the OpenAI chief executive, is trying to raise $7 trillion in funding to basically progress this technology. Huge, staggering amount of money, would be the biggest deal in human history in terms of money. And so it kind of just shows you how much is being invested into this technology and how much it's going to grow kind of in future years. But we're also seeing massive impact already on existing industries. So anything from journalism, advertising, in recruitment, we're seeing AI have quite a big impact on not only how companies are hiring, but also how they're thinking about needing to assess candidates who are using AI as part of the recruitment process. So there's already kind of big impacts happening, both kind of formal and informal. And we're seeing it in healthcare as well, which I'll talk about a little bit later on, and also in education. And you can see a few examples that I've just included on the screen there. So in the business of advertising, for example, there was a really good article in the Financial Times recently showing how the speed with which now you can generate content ideas for things like an advertising campaign is potentially cutting out that sort of middle person when it comes to maybe freelancers or companies or agencies that would typically do that type of initial idea generation, and how that might impact the industry sort of moving forward. Does it make the quality of advertising better or worse? On the kind of right hand side of the image, you can see the University of Cambridge communications department. They actually kind of put out on their website details about how they use AI from a transparency perspective. And again, that's something I think we might see a lot of companies and organizations doing more of, really talking in detail about this is where we use AI, this is how we're using it. Sports Illustrated magazine in the US recently got in a lot of trouble for putting out an article that they'd found out had been written entirely by AI. And obviously there were kind of questions there about what are we paying for if this is going to be completely generated by technology rather than generated by a human. And in the bottom kind of article, you can see there, this is an example from Australia of an AI chat app that's been trialled in schools within Australia, in New South Wales. And the idea behind this is essentially the school is aware that the students are using AI already. So what it's using is giving them an app that, rather than kind of providing them with the answer and with information, simply asks kind of follow-up questions. So a bit sort of Socratic method type thing to get them thinking, get them reflecting, rather than simply relying on the information that AI puts out. So as I say, huge implications at the moment for how AI is being used across different industries. We can talk a little bit more about that as we move on with specific use cases, but just to give you a sense of sort of what's happening across the board. And then what we're going to kind of move to really is talking about AI for individuals. So this is what we're going to kind of come on to now. And I think, as I mentioned, we're already seeing AI being used by individuals in a range of different roles across industries to, I guess, augment their work, to impact it in different ways, to not necessarily take over, but to perhaps kind of do the heavy lifting with certain parts of work where AI is better suited to do that. So examples of things like, say, content creation and editing, lots of great AI tools now that can kind of do that work very, very quickly as a starting point, even if they're not creating the full product. Certainly for idea generation, we're going to talk about that a little bit later on. This is where AI can really be a useful starting point. It can kind of give you those ideas that help maybe solve that blank page problem, depending on what it is that you're looking to generate. And there's a number of other kind of use cases that we're seeing people already kind of take advantage of AI for within work. So from a data analysis perspective, tools like Microsoft Copilot. If you go to kind of Microsoft Excel on Copilot now, what you'll find is that basically there are lots of things that you can ask it to do simply by a text prompt that will help you generate things that previously you maybe needed quite a complex formula for. Obviously, there are big questions in here about which tools you use. What data are you sharing? If it's commercially sensitive data, you wouldn't put it into something like ChatGPT because you don't know necessarily where that would go. But if your organization has Microsoft, if it's closed down to your organization, the data's secure, is this a way to make those type of roles or those type of tasks much easier, much quicker than they have been before? And as I say, a number of other things that we're seeing people use them for. So, simulating aspects of a job. So taking minutes for a meeting. I know that's something Julie's going to be talking about a little bit later, or automating aspects of our work. So, for example, there's quite a few AI tools that will automate things like within your calendar, for example. If you put things in like saying I'm going to be away for this period. It will automate aspects of maybe responses, not just automatic replies on emails, but also things like maybe kind of pushing meetings that you had back to another time, or maybe kind of pushing project timelines down on different apps that you might have. So there's a lot of kind of stuff at the moment that's coming in with AI that's going to help automate parts of your work that normally you'd have to do manually. And again, it's interesting to consider what that kind of might look like. So as I say, so when we're kind of talking about AI in general, really useful to understand, where does it kind of sit at the moment as a mega trend happening around the world? How is it maybe impacting on different industries or different sectors? So in the last session, we talked a little bit about, how higher education is responding to AI and what that sort of looks like, but also kind of on an individual level, how might it impact the work that you do within your specific service or your specific role? And as I say, we're going to give a couple of examples about that in a second. But just before we kind of get to that, it's really just to sort of, again, reiterate the point that this technology we're talking about is going to be everywhere, if it's not everywhere already, over the next few years. One really great example of this is the custom GPT store from OpenAI. So these are essentially custom chatbots that you can create with your own data. So you can kind of feed information in from a report or from something that you've created, and it will use that data to kind of create a chatbot that you give the parameters for. So for example, here you can see on the screen, there's a whole raft of different ones you can use for cold calling. So either if you wanted to kind of make a cold call, a sales call to somebody, you could kind of use this chatbot to generate ideas. Or maybe if you wanted to respond to a cold call and didn't want to be too rude, it would give you some ideas there as well. There's all sorts of dating chatbots. There are chatbots designed to help you generate PowerPoints, videos, all these sorts of things. And there are ones that are specific for like nutritionists, for personal trainers, so that you can start to see how this type of technology might be used to create really specific, limited use cases for particular things. So that if you wanted, for example, someone to take the knowledge about a particular subject, but put it into something that was accessible 24/7, where you could ask it questions and get a response, that's how these kind of custom chatbots might work. And we're already seeing businesses do this type of thing already. So in the bottom right corner, you'll see Olympia. This is kind of a company where essentially what they're selling is custom chatbots. You subscribe to it and you can get access to all of these different chatbots that are trained in different areas: data analysis, management consultancy, etc. So you're essentially paying for staff, but these staff are actually AI generated rather than human. So really interesting use cases for these already. And as you've probably seen, we're now starting to see AI technology, and generative AI particularly, plugged into all sorts of technology. So the Apple Vision Pro, which are kind of the new sort of virtual reality glasses, again, that's going to have the kind of AI text generation within there so that you can kind of ask it questions and get responses. We're seeing AI kind of being put in standard now as dashboards, for example, in new vehicles. So Volkswagen, for example, one of their newest vehicles has got ChatGPT built into the dashboard, so you can ask it questions as you go. The new Samsung phones have got it in. Again, same with most of the new mobile phones. And also, as we mentioned, things like Microsoft Copilot and a lot of these kind of new products that are coming out are obviously targeting also web search. So Microsoft Bing does that. Google Gemini, OpenAI are also looking to do something around ChatGPT with web search as well that's a bit more accessible on the internet. So we can kind of see how this is going to massively impact all of the different things that form part of our day-to-day lives, and also potentially that form part of our day-to-day work as well. So I will kind of briefly stop there and stop talking. Julie, have we got anything coming back in the chat so far? And if not, we will move on to look at the practical use cases. Sorry, you're just on mute, so I don't know whether you've...
Oh, I was just having a look through the chat as well, just to see. Have a look. There's a little bit of conversation here.
Cool.
So, yeah, I think it's a bit of a conversation around some of the stuff that we talked about before.
Cool. Well, I'll tell you what, I'll pick those up in the chat then whilst we're moving on to the next section.
Yeah.
Because I appreciate we want to have a look through some of these, these sort of practical use cases.
Quite a lot there. So
cool.
That would work well.
Yeah, no problem at all. So What we're going to kind of move on to now is sort of show you 4 practical use cases of how we kind of use AI within our day-to-day work. Again, these are examples that are maybe a bit more specific to what we do as kind of career consultants, but equally, you'll hopefully see some applications for maybe other aspects of your work or the work you do within your service. So what we're kind of approaching this from is this idea of, if you're using AI as an individual, it's really useful to return to this question: what is the problem we're trying to solve? So is there kind of an aspect of our work where maybe AI can potentially have an impact and make life either easier or more effective or more productive? And if so, what does that look like? So with that in mind, I'm going to pass over to Julie. And Julie, do you want me to stop sharing now, or do you want to kind of talk about this a little bit first before you start sharing your screen?
Sorry. Yeah, I think I might just quickly talk about it. So the example I was going to use is when you do a bit of writing and you use ChatGPT. So I was just interested to know how many people here have actually tried using ChatGPT for and helping them with any sort of writing. So if you have, just stick your hand up so we can get an idea of how many people have done that. Oh, okay. So quite a few people.
Yeah, I've got about 9 or 10. Yeah, still going. Yeah.
And does anyone want to share in the chat what they've used it for? Like what type of writing they were doing with the ChatGPT? Okay, so Laura's saying she wasn't impressed, which I can understand. Okay, so questions, introductions, text for event adverts. Okay, so making up articles. Yeah, Laura, I could see what I'm going to share an example in a minute, and it's the kind of thing that I found as well. You have to kind of restructure what it's given you. Yeah. So it's interesting to see everyone's experience of what it does and kind of how useful it is. So the funny thing is that, well, I'll share my example in a second once we've had a little bit of a chance for everyone to kind of share what they've used it for. Say that's an interesting one. I do find that if you ask it, it can sort of, it seems to come up with letters for particular purposes. And often that's quite helpful. And it seems to understand like the rules and things. Anyway, so the example I was going to share, I'll just share my screen. Have I got permission to share, Chris? Is it my
you'll be fine.
Right, okay. So this is just to explain, this was when I was doing a blog post and I decided to try and I wrote the post first, and then I just asked ChatGPT if it could help me make it more student friendly. And I find it's always really interesting to get ideas. Another time I put something through ChatGPT for a kind of an update, like a newsletter type thing, and then it actually gave me some emojis as well that would suit students. That was really handy. Okay, so I've pasted it in. This is what I wrote myself to start with. And I have a few bullet points. It's quite long. And I asked it to, so can you restructure and simplify the content while making sure it's still sort of it's like none of the content's lost, it's just more concise. And then this is what it came up with. So I thought this was really interesting because it actually restructured it for me. So it put these headings in some numbers, and it decided to make some steps. So as you can see, it sort of, and it was more made it more easy to read. And then, as a few people have said, some of the language didn't feel quite right, so I restructured it again, redrafted, and then this is actually what I posted. So it's sort of similar to ChatGPT, but just a bit more, just adjusted some of the language. So that's my example anyway. And I found it just saved me all that time of trying to edit it down myself. And also like the ideas it gave me in terms of the headings and how to structure it differently rather than just one long block with a few bullet points was really helpful.
Yeah, thanks, Julia. It's sort of what you've said there kind of ties into a couple of people have sort of mentioned in the chat that kind of starting point is really helpful. Seen a couple of people kind of mention maybe specific cases that are around. Heather's talked about kind of teaching nominations. Other people have mentioned examples for questions, policy statements, those sort of things that maybe then just need kind of the tweaking afterwards. So I think, like you were saying, just not using it as the sole creator, but maybe to just adapt, I guess, things that you've done already, or as a starting point, I suppose. Anything else you wanted to add there, Julia, Tom?
No, I think that's just a quick example. It looks like quite a few people have done something similar too, which is good.
Cool. Okay, so we'll move on to sort of test case number 2 then. So this is kind of very much around, I guess, how AI would describe itself as a thinking partner. And what I'm going to show you is a chatbot called Hey Pi, which you may have come across before. So Hey Pi is kind of created by Inflection AI, so it's slightly different, and it's sort of marketed as an AI assistant. So the idea is it's essentially marketed as it's there for you for anything that you need it for, which feels very kind of broad and perhaps a little bit of an oversell. But it's really quite spookily human in the way that it responds, and you can get it to respond with a voice, or you can just have it respond in text. And one thing that this can kind of be quite useful for is just bouncing ideas around if you've not got someone to talk to. Now, obviously, it's in no way, can kind of replicate speaking to another human being, not in my experience anyway. But what it can do is kind of give you ways to throw questions at yourself rather than just sitting there and kind of writing stuff down. So I've got an example on the screen here where I've given it sort of an initial starting point. I've got to maybe make a choice at work involving taking part in some training. So let's give it a little bit of a scenario. So let's say I've got a choice between leadership and management training, or specializing in, let's say, AI, for example.
That's a fascinating choice, and both options sound like they have a lot of potential. Leadership and management training could...
I'm going to mute that because the voice is really annoying me. I don't know if you can hear that, but you can choose about 6 different voices for it. So what you can kind of see with this is, it actually kind of responds in a fairly sort of human type fashion. It's been kind of created to almost sort of be like a coaching style chatbot. So there are kind of issues in here, and we're going to talk a little bit about this kind of towards the end of the session around the ethical side. But what's quite interesting is it's kind of built on prompting you to give you more questions. So it very rarely just gives you information and stops. It really kind of asks you questions about the things that you're doing. So here you can see, for example, it's sort of said to us, okay, it's quite positive, quite encouraging. It's given us some quite generic spiel, but what it has done is sort of said to us, okay, have you considered this? So it sort of gives you and throws out questions to continually prompt your thinking. So obviously there are limitations here. I wouldn't really suggest anybody use this as a substitute for a coach necessarily, although there are kind of paid versions of these bots that are trying to make that claim. But it's quite an interesting one to use just to sort of throw ideas around with yourself. And what we're seeing a lot more, and this has just been announced by OpenAI this week as well, is there's a lot more focus now on memory. So these kind of chatbots memorizing, knowing about you. The changes they're bringing into ChatGPT, for example, will allow you to choose whether you want it to remember you and remember things about you that help improve the answers that it gives. And that's exactly what Pi does. If you sign up to it, it remembers previous conversations and can bring those sort of things in. So almost becomes your own little AI assistant and a way to throw ideas around. So just another one that, if you've not kind of seen it, is a way that we're seeing a few people use AI in work as a way just to kind of almost throw out ideas, have questions prompted to them without necessarily always having to have somebody on hand to do that with. So be interested to hear sort of people's thoughts about that. Julie, back to you.
Thanks, Chris. So I'm going to show another example here. So 1 second while I just share my screen. I'll just find the right page. Bear with me. Right. So this is a tool called Fireflies AI, and it's a note-taking tool. And what it does is you can download it as an app, or you can have it on your laptop or whatever, and then you can set it up, and it's got a lot of features that are automated. So as you can see here, one of the things it can do is to sort of, you can press some, one of the settings just lets it go through all your calendars and just invite itself to every single meeting in all of your calendars. And then when you go to the meeting, it just comes along with you, and then it instantly transcribes all your meetings. And as you can see, it catches video, audio, it generates transcripts, it integrates, it puts it in everything, it saves it for you, it does everything, which sounds great until the experience I had on the other end of it. So this is a meeting outside work, and I was helping to run a group, and it's actually a support group, and it was on Zoom. And what happened was one of the members arrived, and we saw the member arrive because you could see who's arriving and you let them in. And then we had this other sort of thing with a similar name. And I noticed this and thought, oh, maybe the person's got like 2 devices, like sometimes you do in Zoom. And I sort of messaged the person who was hosting the meeting and said, can you sort of just check with this? And what happened was we realised afterwards that I think the person messaged whoever had brought this, Firefly's AI bot with them and said, could you, what's going on here and everything. And they had set it up because I think they used it outside at work and things, and it had just gone through all their calendars and it invited them. And so the issues here were it's automatically recording every single meeting that they went to. And in the case of our self-help group, it's not the kind of thing where you want, we're not, you wouldn't record things or upload them somewhere from that sort of group. And the other thing is it didn't actually ask us all if this was okay. When you're on Teams or Zoom and you're going to record the meeting and it gives you notification. So there's just so many issues with this. And I tested to see if I could download the app, and I have to say, fortunately, within Teams and within anything to do with the university, you wouldn't be able to bring any external software, and I'm quite grateful for the security settings. I mean, it's a useful thing, and I wonder whether this will get sorted out, but it's just a potential issue that I came across.
Yeah, and I think it's a really good point, Julie. And obviously, with some of the stuff we're talking about here, particularly kind of in Teams under the new Microsoft 365 has this functionality, has this AI functionality to automatically transcribe and summarize, documents, meetings, these sorts of things, which obviously, as you said, internally within an organization is fine if all of that data is kept within the organization. The tough part is who has AI apps and who's using them. We've been using, for some of the stuff that we do for the AGCAS Graduate Transitions Task Group, which is kind of HE sector wide, we've been using a tool called Video Highlight for summarizing meeting kind of notes from a pre-recorded YouTube video. But again, that's kind of it doesn't come into the meeting with us. It's something we sort of use afterwards. Good question that's come from sort of Annabelle in the chat, Julia. Yeah, how do you know if the app is recording the meeting? So it's visible as an attendee from what you said, or it kind of appears as an attendee. Is that right?
Yes and no. It actually had a person's name, so I just assumed, because I had never heard of this in my life before, I just thought that this person had started, might start off on an iPad and it wasn't working, so they'd use the phone. So no, I didn't know it had entered the meeting. I do now, because I think the key thing is if you know what you're looking for. So it had the person's name and then said .Firefly's AI. So it kind of entered the meeting without any of us being aware.
Yeah.
And we let it in because we just thought it was someone on their iPad or a different device.
Yeah, and I've seen Laura's kind of mentioned in the chat here, if someone's AI bot joined a training webinar without the actual person being present, so had to kind of kick it out, appeared as so-and-so's AI assistant. So yeah, I think it's, the third-party app side is a really, perhaps kind of worrying development in some ways, because again, if you were sort of an independent practitioner, perhaps kind of less worrying, but working within an organization where maybe there's commercially sensitive data and you've got external meetings and someone's choosing to use that software, how do you kind of protect your data in that sort of scenario? So I think there's some interesting and, as people have said, slightly kind of worrying scenarios within there. But thanks for sharing that, Julie. Certainly, I think from a use case perspective, this idea of automating particular administrative tasks is going to become one of the core functions that speeds up elements of work through generative AI. Certainly from kind of like the minuting summarizing side of things. I've been using Video Highlight for a while to kind of summarize meeting notes, and it is incredibly quick and fairly accurate even at this stage. So as that technology develops, I think we're going to see that becoming more and more common, rather than the process perhaps of kind of manual minuting we've sort of seen in the past. So I'm going to just move on to the final sort of use case before we kind of pass back over to you and see and share some of your own ideas. So this kind of really, I suppose, this sort of fourth use case is very much around idea generation, and I guess what I would call sort of building the skeleton of ideas. So not necessarily using AI to generate all of the content, but to use it as a way to kind of solve the blank page problem, start us off in a variety of different areas. And the examples I'm going to show you are all kind of career development specific examples, so things that we've used to kind of support students in one-to-one appointments or in kind of group sessions with understanding where they could get a benefit out of using tools like ChatGPT. So all of these are kind of built on quite specific prompts. And this is the one thing I think it's really important to say with a lot of the text-generated AI tools that you may have used already. If you try and just put any old kind of prompt or any old sort of request in there, you tend to get back fairly generic stuff, as a lot of people have mentioned in the chat. So what I've kind of been doing is keeping sort of a custom library. So a library of prompts that are a bit more specific, a bit more kind of specialized, have a bit more context, that allow you to kind of get better results. And we've used these for kind of different use cases. So one of them, like in this instance on screen, might be about helping to generate practice interview questions for a job interview. So with students, we would always caveat this saying, this isn't going to give you the exact questions that would come out at interview. It's not going to give you perfect examples, but it might give you kind of a flavour of what you could expect based on the different types of interview questions you might see. And you can see if you put in kind of a job description, what you'll get out then is fairly sort of reasonable starting points for practice interview questions based on what you've given it. And again, these would never necessarily be used as the final example, but these might just be a starting point for discussion with an individual, or a starting point for them to reflect on, have they thought about which of these questions could come up on an interview? So that's just kind of one example there. Another one that we've used previously is around, again, modelling. So this is where I think you find some of these kind of text generation tools can be really, really helpful. So this is one, for example, working with an individual who'd never come across the STAR technique of providing interview answers. So using this kind of prompt, it actually provides an example that that person can then use to sort of replicate with their own experiences. And in fact, we even kind of used one here from their experience and said, okay, well, this is how it might look. This is how it might model. Now, obviously, this person's experience was quite different. So it was really there just to give them that sense of, when we talk about this technique that I'm, as yet unfamiliar with, how could I kind of replicate this? What would it look like if I did it myself? And almost giving that framework to start with. Some of the other uses we've kind of used it for, things like career exploration. So in terms of kind of idea generation, this can often be something that students and graduates find quite challenging, particularly when they're starting to think about, what could be out there for me. So this is an example of a prompt, not necessarily to kind of help them decide what do I want to do, because that's a bit too kind of linear, but more to kind of generate ideas based on their interests, skills, values. So you can see here there's a specific prompt that asks the kind of GPT to come up with some broad areas of work or job titles or things like that linked to a specific set of skills and interests. What we then see is you can kind of put in the things that are of interest to you. So it might be kind of particular subjects of interest. It might be, the values, I want to help people lead happier lives. Maybe I kind of enjoy analysing. These are the tasks that I like to perform. These are the skills that I'm good at. And then what it can do is sort of give out these initial ideas of areas of work. So not necessarily telling you these are the things you should do, but just, have you considered these types of things? And typically in kind of one-to-one or group sessions, we could then use these to actually kind of further that conversation with an individual. So not about kind of giving information, but more about, from say a career guidance perspective, this has kind of opened up a range of pathways. What do we think about these? Spending more time on that kind of human guidance side rather than on sort of the information search kind of provision side. And then finally, just an example for idea generation that's a little bit different. We're seeing quite a lot of people use things like ChatGPT and other tools for generating ideas for stuff like social media posts, blogs, as kind of Julie mentioned. And this is an example of just kind of how simply you can get something like ChatGPT to produce ideas for a blog post, or for in this case, a social media post. You can specify the kind of type of post that you want, and you can see that it kind of churns out something that broadly meets the kind of structure you would expect for, say, an Instagram post in this example. And then from there, you can also use it to do other things, such as kind of create sample images. Again, this is quite an old one, and you will find with the image creation, certainly through kind of DALL-E, that it's variable in terms of what it produces, in terms of both the quality, the diversity of what's in the images. And again, as Julie mentioned earlier, some of the cultural stereotypes that are sort of built in to the data. So, but what it can do is give you that starting point, or maybe 3 or 4 ideas for you to kind of choose from. Ultimately, it's not doing the work for you, but it's giving you that starting point that you can then kind of come from. So those were just sort of 4 kind of very quick use cases that we wanted to go through. And what we kind of want to move on to now is just to kind of get some sense from yourselves about where you're already kind of using generative AI within your own sort of specific cases, within work or within the service you work within, or things that you might be thinking of now based on kind of what we've talked about so far. So I'm just going to go back to the PowerPoint. Sorry, bear with me. There we go. And I'm going to return to Mentimeter, or ask you to return to Mentimeter in a second. But just before I kind of do that, it's just sort of a reminder, really, with all the things that we've been talking about, when we've been mentioning using AI kind of within the framework of the university, we've kind of been basing that on the principles that the university has for students. So you kind of find these on the website. We talked about them in the last session a little bit. That idea of kind of making sure that AI is being treated as a tool, you know, using it cautiously in terms of the data that's being put into it, obviously not putting private data, commercially sensitive data in there, understanding that it can provide misinformation, it can hallucinate and create stuff that isn't there, and making sure that from a student perspective, they're always kind of keeping within the framework of what is required for their assignment. You know, what are the kind of limitations that have been put on that assignment in terms of use of AI, but also sort of encouraging AI literacy. You know, why am I using this? What are the considerations I need to kind of bear in mind? And the same is true for staff. So again, Steve, who was with us at the last session, was talking about some of the kind of principles for staff around, you know, data protection issues that we've talked about, checking for inaccuracy and bias. And obviously with all of these things, I mentioned obviously about using AI maybe to help with career exploration. If you don't have somebody there, like a careers professional, who's perhaps got that domain knowledge, that could potentially be quite dangerous in terms of where you follow that information or you take that as gospel. So I think with all of the things we're talking about, and when you're considering where to use AI within your own work, we shouldn't really ignore domain knowledge. It is incredibly important for that checking of inaccuracy and bias. No matter what the AI produces, it needs checking, it needs fact checking. And unless you've got that domain knowledge, that can kind of be quite tricky. So yeah, the principles for students and staff kind of foreground all of the stuff that we do when we're using it within our roles. So what I'm going to do now is return to Mentimeter. So if you're already on the Mentimeter from earlier, you should see the next question come up in a second. And what we'd like you to do is just sort of share either in the Mentimeter or in the chat, whichever you're more kind of comfortable with, what sort of potential or already realised use cases can you see for generative AI within your specific service, role or area of work? So we've got people here from registry, CLS, we've got people who've come from academic standpoint, some from professional services, students' union, so quite a broad range of people here today. And just what we'd like to know really is, yeah, how are you already using generative AI, or how might you be planning to use it within perhaps the specific context within your role or the area of work that you're in at the moment? So I'm going to kind of switch back to the Mentimeter and just give you a couple of minutes, if you can, to kind of fill that in for us. Okay, so hopefully you should be able to see this on the screen now. It should be coming through. There we go. Again, if you're not able to access the Mentimeter, or you kind of would prefer to put this in the chat, that is absolutely fine. Please do feel free to put it in the Microsoft Teams chat instead. So yeah, these are really kind of just your examples at the moment. We've heard a few of them already, but what I'm also kind of quite interested in is, are there kind of other things that you're not using generative AI for yet that you'd maybe like to moving forward? And yeah, how might it kind of impact your role specifically? The flip side of that, which someone's just put on the top right-hand corner, which is brilliant, is you may see that there's actually no application for it at the moment in your job. And if so, that's really interesting to know. And I'd be quite interested to hear why you feel that is, if you're happy to share that in the chat. So yeah, thanks to everyone who's kind of sharing this now. What we will do is we'll make sure that any of these responses we kind of put into the PowerPoint that we share after the session as well, so that you've got, you know, access to all of these if we don't have time to look at them all now. So really interesting to kind of see what's sort of coming through already. Lots of people kind of things that are sort of adjacent to what we talked about earlier. So we've talked about stuff like idea generation. People have talked about, you know, possible help with recording meeting minutes. Something we're going to kind of move on to in a second, chatbots. Could that be a solution for maybe part of the work that you do? If so, how? So that's a really interesting one. Some people are using it already to generate images and presentation templates. Yeah, I think a good example actually of how it's built into so much software at the moment is Canva. If you use Canva, that has got generative AI built into it already. So if you use Canva regularly, you're probably already using it to generate things like images and presentation templates. Some people are kind of using it for more sort of programming based tasks, so coding, bug checking, so kind of using it as a way to sort of check work that they've done, or using it as a way to maybe produce work that they can then check. So again, really useful. And as some people have mentioned, it's where generative AI can be really, really helpful is maybe in tasks that would take a huge amount of time for us normally. So things like possibly kind of like large data processing, and then actually the analysis or decision making coming from a human rather than from the kind of the bot. So I think that's, you know, that's an interesting point made there. And also kind of the idea that actually we might use it as a backup, as a safety net, rather than the first port of call. So it might be taking minutes for us in the background so that we've got a backup, but ultimately we might want to take those minutes because we feel that based on our experience, we can condense and we can pull things out really quickly. So I think, you know, some really important points there. Other stuff kind of coming through, people have talked about, suggestions for structuring writing. So maybe not doing everything, but just kind of structuring it, you know, as a starting point. A couple of people have mentioned things like creating standardized responses. So, you know, if I want that kind of boilerplate template that I might use for just generating, you know, this is something I have to send out 50 times a year. Have I got a nice generic template that I can use that I'm not having to necessarily devise myself? Others have kind of put, again, stuff related to data. So things like attendance monitoring, is there a way to do that? Or sort of picking stuff out of maybe big kind of pools of data that it's maybe much quicker at doing, generating things that maybe take a little bit of thinking time to do that perhaps people don't have time for in their roles, LinkedIn posts, social media posts, those sorts of things. And again, some interesting ones that maybe come back to the stuff that we talked about with Pi. So stuff like consultation partner, using it as a way to kind of bounce ideas off, or maybe kind of throw in proposals and see what it kind of comes back with in terms of challenging with questions, or maybe doing that in a completely different way. So interested to hear sort of kind of what you've done there. Some people have also mentioned stuff like sort of checking things, so maybe kind of checking accessibility. Obviously kind of Grammarly Go has got artificial intelligence in, that's quite useful for kind of general checking and actually for writing assistant type stuff as well. But that's quite an interesting use case identified there, where maybe an automated checker can't. You know, perhaps there is a way to kind of use generative AI to do that. But we've also got a few people really here talking about saying maybe not necessarily at a point yet where I know how to use it or want to use it. And this is what we're going to move on to in a second in terms of that question of why. Yes, the technology is out there, but why maybe? Should we be using it, and how? So that's really useful, really important that somebody's mentioned that. We're going to come back to that in a second. Final one I just want to kind of highlight, and then Julie, I'll see if we've got anything else in the chat, is just to create bad examples to teach students how to be critical independent thinkers. This is what the school in New South Wales and Australia were really trying to do, is rather than getting students to basically take everything that was said on ChatGPT as gospel, they created their own chatbot to really make it much more Socratic, much more kind of question focused, trying to encourage that critical thinking. So yeah, I think that's a really important point as well. Lots and lots of great responses in here. As I say, what I'll make sure is that I will share all of these as part of the PowerPoint slides after the session. But Julie, just before we move on, anything else kind of in the chat that sort of links to these points, or anything else that we might want to bring up?
There's just a bit of a discussion about, I think, where are we now? One person said about working with books, therefore they don't use AI. And we've discussed different things about how we've used it. So apparently it's really good at coding. There's a question about the Copilot, you know, in our sort of Microsoft tools. I know I've seen it in the search engine, but not, I don't, is it still in Word and all the other software? Oh, you're on mute, Chris.
sorry, my understanding with the university so far is that it would have the capacity to, but last time I checked, we haven't got it turned on for the university, as far as I'm aware. Somebody in the group may be able to kind of correct me on that. So that's my kind of current understanding. Now, it's worth noting that in the kind of Microsoft Bing search engine, you'll see that also referred to as Copilot. So there's kind of a little bit of kind of confusion there sometimes. So that version you can use if you go into the Bing search engine, you'll be able to use Copilot in the corner. You can kind of use it to generate text, generate images, all those sorts of things. But in terms of the tools that are built into Microsoft Office, at the moment, as far as I know, we can't use them across the university, but I could be wrong. So if somebody knows different to me, please do feel free to put in the chat. I've certainly not seen them in the Office kind of tools that I've been using at the moment. But yeah, they are available now in the enterprise version of Microsoft, and people are using them already across various different businesses. So I'm not sure how that holds for the uni. So what we're going to do is kind of move on now, and I suppose kind of come to that question of why that just sort of came up in those responses. And I'm going to show you kind of something that's being developed at the moment by myself and a colleague at the Open University, which is kind of built around the question I suppose we haven't covered yet. So we've talked about practical use cases, we've talked about what's happening with AI in the workplace, but we've maybe not actually talked about perhaps the most important question, which is, you know, when, where, why we might actually choose to use it. And as some people have kind of surfaced in the chat and on the Mentimeter, what are the implications of doing that? And I think this is often kind of quite common with new technology. You know, we go, it's brilliant, it's out there, let's use it. But actually, a bit like the AI principles for the university, sometimes the important question to ask is the one right at the very beginning, which is, what do I need to think of first, kind of before I do that? So this is a new framework that, as I say, is kind of being developed at the moment between myself and Lee Fowkes at the Open University. It's called the 4C framework, and it's essentially kind of a conceptual tool, conceptual kind of reflection tool for thinking about your relationship with AI in a professional capacity. So the idea is it's broken into kind of 4 quadrants. You've got confidence, which focuses on one of those questions we asked at the beginning: how confident am I in using generative artificial intelligence tools, or kind of understanding it? Competence, which looks at, you know, what's my kind of skill level in being able to use these tools? Is it something where, yeah, I feel quite comfortable generating text, videos, all sorts of different things, and using a variety of different tools? Or is it something where I'm maybe not so sure? Context, which is very much around, you know, how influential do I think generative AI is going to be in my specific context, within my role, my service, or my world, so to speak. And then criticality, so what's my kind of position on generative AI? Is it something where I'm kind of very much embracing of it, I'm really sort of keen to use it for lots of different use cases? Or is it something where I feel a little bit more kind of skeptical, cautious about how or when and where I might use it? So the idea behind this framework is to kind of help sort of surface, how do I feel about AI within a professional capacity, and how might that influence what I do in terms of why I choose to use AI, but also in terms of, you know, what use cases I might use it for, and what are the considerations I maybe need to think about before I start using it. So as I say, the idea is this is kind of a bit of a mixture of a personal development tool and a bit of a conceptual framework. And the idea behind these domains are not necessarily that they're set in stone. They're not designed to kind of be, you know, if I'm at this level, I'm at this level forever. It's not meant to be kind of like a determiner of sort of saying, this is me and I'm never going to change in my relationship with AI. But it's more of a way to kind of frame how you might be thinking about AI from a professional perspective, so that you can kind of start to think about, you know, other areas that I might need to upskill in or kind of improve my skills in. Are there sort of particular considerations I haven't thought about when it comes to using it? And actually, maybe within the team that I work within, how do I position myself in relation to other people that I work with in terms of the understanding of the technology? So it's a guide. It's designed to be a bit of a reflective tool. And what we want to do for the final part of the session is kind of get you thinking about your relationship with AI in reference to this tool, which I'm going to go through in a second. And again, return to Mentimeter and get a bit of a sense of where people feel they are before giving you something to take away from the session to sort of try in your own time in terms of kind of reflecting on your relationship with generative AI in a work context. So this is kind of how the framework works. As I say, it's sort of split into 4 quadrants, and for each kind of quadrant, we ask a question. So for confidence, confidence is, as we say, talking about your sense of your own capabilities. So, you know, where do you kind of sit in terms of your I guess, awareness of generative AI? How confident do you feel in that? Obviously, it's not something that's necessarily measurable. It's kind of often about how you feel. And it may not necessarily be to do with your kind of actual competence, but just how confident you feel talking about AI, understanding what's out there, even if you don't necessarily use it very much. So we've got kind of two options for this one. Cautious, so people who kind of feel that maybe they're generally approaching the topic, bit of apprehension, maybe being quite cautious about how you use it, or maybe seeking additional information before you kind of jump in. And then kind of confident individuals who maybe are quite comfortable navigating generative AI by themselves, you know, experimenting with stuff actively, maybe not necessarily seeing themselves as proficient, but kind of feeling quite empowered to sort of use AI tools as and when they need to. Competence, very much around kind of your actual skills, knowledge and behaviours linked to AI. So that idea of, you know, do you have the technical proficiency to use AI tools? Do you have the understanding of kind of how they work, the ethical implications? And actually kind of, are you critical about your own use of AI, or do you just kind of use it for any purpose and never really kind of stop to think about why you're using it or what the kind of benefits and potential risks might be? So again, we've got kind of two categories here. Novice is very much you're starting to explore and develop skills in using AI. So you feel like you're just kind of dipping your toe in the water. You've maybe used things like ChatGPT, but maybe not too many of the other tools that are available. And then we've got the advanced side, which is, you know, feeling much more kind of proficient. You've maybe got a bit more of a broader understanding of video creation tools, editing tools, data analysis tools, and you may be already guiding and kind of supporting colleagues or other people that you know with understanding more about AI. The third kind of strand is criticality. So this is really around your stance on AI. So how do you kind of feel about this at the moment? What is your outlook and attitude on the technology as a whole? And this is really broken down into, again, two sections. Skeptical, where we're talking about people who are generally a bit more questioning, a bit more cautious, kind of a bit more reserved towards AI in general, and kind of really scrutinizing how it works and how it's being used. So a couple of people in the chat have mentioned about that, you know, really thinking about, am I ready to jump in yet? Have I really assessed its potential fully? And then the second side of that is embracing. So people who are a bit more receptive, generally kind of maybe throwing themselves into using AI a little bit more sort of proactively, or may even be kind of advocates for AI across their service or across the university, talking about it kind of quite regularly. And then the final one is context. So this is very much around you personally and the environment that you exist in. So the broader landscape, how is generative AI going to have an impact on wider society, your life personally, your professional life? How might the technology kind of disrupt what you're doing at the moment, the work that you do on a daily basis, or generally what's happening within the industry or the organisation where you work? And the key thing about this is it's not maybe just personal to you, but also potentially applies to your organisation that you work in as well. So perhaps here at the university, how do we see the university dealing with AI? You know, is it in a limited context, or is it kind of quite significant to sort of day-to-day practices? So you can see here that context is again split into two. Limited, which is very much around within your personal context, or maybe what the industry or service that you work in, you're seeing kind of perhaps minimal change or minimal influence. So somebody in the chat, I think on the Mentimeter, mentioned, don't really see it influencing my workplace just yet, or influencing the work that I do. And that might be the case at this point in time. It could of course change over time. And then the second strand is significant. So this idea of, actually, I think generative AI is going to have a really big impact on what I'm doing at the moment, and a really big impact on the wider world around me, the industry that I work in, the day-to-day of kind of what I do within my sort of sector or service or job role. So those are kind of the four sort of strands of the framework. And the idea behind this is really, as I say, not to kind of put people into boxes or get people sort of entrenched in one way of thinking, but really is like a reflective tool to get you thinking about your relationship with generative AI and how it might affect you on a professional basis. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go back to the Mentimeter, and I'm going to show you the 4 different questions in a row. And what I'd like you to do is just kind of put one of those 2 statements, choose one of those 2 options for each of the 4 questions that I share. I'll bring up the Mentimeter on screen first, and then I'll just remind everyone what we're doing, if that's okay. So, Julie, hopefully you can see this okay.
Yep, I can see that fine.
Wonderful. So what we'd like you to do is choose one of these options for the 4 questions that we're going to share. So the first one is about confidence. Which statement best matches how confident you feel when thinking about working with generative AI tools? You've got two options, cautious and confident. So again, we'll just give people about a minute to make that choice. And again, if you can't access the Mentimeter, feel free to put your thoughts in the chat instead. So just while people are kind of coming through with this, Julie, looks like kind of majority, it's evening out a little bit, but majority perhaps kind of veering more towards the cautious side. Any surprise there, or does that kind of tally with what you think we've seen across the session so far?
Sorry, are you asking me, Chris?
Yes.
I wouldn't do it like a question to everyone, but the busy answer in the Mentimeter survey. Yeah, I suppose. I think it's quite natural to be cautious, though, isn't it? Because there's sort of like there's good things, and then there's like lots of concerns as well. And then I know one thing we didn't address was Rachel mentioned about the environment, so that's like another thing to think about too. So I'm not really surprised. No, I think that's a very healthy approach to it.
Yeah, and this is quite an interesting one because I think when we come to like the criticality side, I think it'd be interesting to see what people feel here, because as you said, that's where that really the ethical side comes in, whether we're talking about data privacy, copyright infringement, whether we're talking about the longer term environmental cost. A lot of chat at the moment about what OpenAI and other companies are doing to try and mitigate the environmental impact, but the truth is it takes a huge amount of energy to produce even one token, one kind of response, from an AI system. So very, very fair sort of concerns there that maybe fit a little bit more under the kind of criticality side, but yeah, nonetheless really important. So what I will ask is, while you're doing this, take a record of which of the responses you have for each question, and I'll explain why afterwards. So for each of the options that you pick for the 4 questions, if you just record them somewhere, either on your phone, just write them down, and once you've got kind of all 4 responses, it'll become clear why we want you to do that. But so yeah, do keep a record of what you're putting down for each one. So that was about confidence. Our next one is around competence. So this question is, which statement best matches your current skill level in being able to use generative AI tools? So as a novice, do you feel that maybe, it's just dipping your toe in the water? Advanced, is it something where you feel fairly kind of comfortable with lots of different tools? You're trying AI, you're maybe using it on quite a regular basis. Okay, brilliant. Again, thanks for sharing that. I think we're seeing pretty kind of similar trend again. So majority kind of putting themselves in that novice category, smaller amount maybe in the advanced category. Again, none of this is kind of set in stone. And of course, we are only offering 2 options. So it is by that nature like fairly kind of binary. And there's obviously going to be ranges across both novice and advanced. You might have someone who is in the advanced category, but very much a novice in that category, and someone who's in the novice category, but quite advanced end of that category. So appreciate this does simplify things slightly, but appreciate you kind of sharing your thoughts here. And again, as we've sort of heard today, majority may be putting themselves in that novice category for now. The next question is around, so this is around the kind of criticality. So your attitude towards generative AI, are you someone who's quite embracing of the technology, or are you someone who's generally quite skeptical, a bit more cautious, a bit more prudent when it comes to using it? And again, this kind of comes back to your point, Julie, that you mentioned from the chat around, are there reasons that you might be skeptical? Could it be due to concerns around data privacy, environmental challenges? Could it be around how people are using them? We've just had a few AI companies come out to say that they're going to be banning the creation of images on image creation sites that replicate Joe Biden or Donald Trump this year, because they're really concerned about people producing deep fakes or propaganda to influence the US election. And of course, that could also be true for the UK elections coming up this year, the elections in India. And I think there's 30 countries worldwide this year that are having major elections. So it could be a huge year for AI influencing that type of thing if they're not careful. So again, yeah, majority of people, 2/3 really kind of, or just under 2/3 sort of fitting in the skeptical category, with about 1/3 maybe, or just over 1/3 a bit more embracing. Again, Julie, what are your sort of thoughts there? Does that sort of tally for you in terms of where you kind of expect people to be?
Yeah, I don't think it's a surprise to anyone really. I mean, conversations you have with people as well, So I think the other thing is there's just so many different tools out there. It's sometimes a bit bewildering, and you don't know exactly like what all of them do exactly, and sometimes you don't know what they're doing with your data, or so I don't think it's surprising really.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think examples that you sort of mentioned earlier around fireflies would I think would make anybody skeptical, or at least cautious, you know, when you've kind of experienced some of that firsthand. So, so great, thanks for sharing that. And then the last one is around context. So this is around how influential you think generative AI will be for you within your professional role, within your personal life, or just more generally from a societal perspective. Is it going to be limited? Is it going to be more significant? So yeah, let's see how we kind of get on with those. And interestingly, a lot more kind of even already, this one. And I think part of that may be kind of in the question, you know, if we were to reframe that as how limited or significant do you see it being for the world, people might have slightly sort of different perspectives on it. But I think it's really useful to look at this from a personal point of view. You know, how is this going to impact potentially yourself from a professional capacity, you know, within the work that you do? And we heard various people with slightly different perspectives on it during the session. Some saying, I can't really see how it's going to impact my work for now. Some saying, yeah, I'm already using it on a regular basis. These are the things that are working. These are the things that are not working. So really interesting that this is very much neck and neck, 50-50, or just over 50 at the moment for limited, but really, really tight. And again, that perhaps kind of reflects that depending on the work that you're doing, you know, it's really going to be quite contextual for you about how much you might be using generative AI or for what purposes. So yeah, thank you. Really interesting to see that one being a lot closer than some of the other ones. Julie, is there anything in the chat, anything else just to kind of add to this that's not appeared on the Mentimeter, or anything else people are wanting to share just before we move on?
Just about these, like the ability to deep fake videos, and about images and being based on real people, because I guess that is one of the problematic elements of the whole thing, of being able to generate something and nobody knows sort of where it's come from, or kind of if it's sort of genuine or not.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, you know, Graham's kind of put this in the chat, that idea of producing images based on real people is so problematic. Should it be banned? I know there's some stuff in the European Union AI Act which is covering some of those type of purposes, but again, how they regulate that in different markets, for example, the US, China, other places around the world, be really interesting to see, because of course, you know, others may have different views, and yeah, it's going to be very interesting to see how on earth they actually enforce that or police any of it. So the idea behind that, thank you for kind of taking the time to fill that in, was to sort of give you just a sense of, are there kind of areas that you've thought about so far when it comes to AI beyond just the practical applications of tools? Have you kind of asked that question of why? You know, why might I use AI? And what we feel is that this framework might be kind of a way to just help sort of contextualize some of that and help you think about both your kind of confidence in terms of using the tools and how, you know, practically, you know, how comfortable you are using them, but also from that kind of slightly stepped back perspective, what are maybe the things you need to consider when it comes to being more skeptical or more embracing about the technology in relation to the work that you do, the service that you work for, the clients that you work with, you know, whether those are students, graduates, businesses, for example, and actually your specific context. So what was interesting there was people were kind of quite on the fence. Some people feel that it's going to be very significant for their particular context. You know, they might be using AI very regularly. Others feel at the moment maybe it's really not having that much of an impact, and whether that will change over time remains to be seen. So this in itself, I guess, is kind of potentially a little bit dry. So what we're going to give you to kind of take away, and I'll send this out in the email after the session, and I'll kind of just remind people of this before we finish in the next few minutes, is we've actually kind of put together a little bit of a quiz, I suppose, to kind of give you one of 16 different combinations. So the responses to those questions that you've come up with, the confidence, competence, criticality, and context, you'll have a word for each of those. So it might be cautious, novice, skeptical, and limited, for example. And there are 16 of these different combinations. What we've done is we've taken these combinations, and using AI, we've kind of turned them into a different Gen AI spirit animal. And we're going to share this kind of PDF with you so that you can have a look at this and determine kind of where you come out as one of these 16 different animals. The cautious cat, for example, the open octopus, the questioning elephant, the exploring eagle, and various others. And the idea behind this is not to kind of make things sort of too serious, but to kind of give you something that you come out with at the end of this that perhaps kind of captures where you feel you're at the moment, and potentially kind of acts as a bit of a discussion point, a reflection point to think about why you find yourself in that position with AI, how that kind of is impacting on your day-to-day work, and whether you feel that's a position that you're likely to stay in, or whether you feel actually it's something that you want to kind of change from, or actually something that you feel quite confident about. Yeah, this is kind of where I'm at the moment, and I'm at this point for a reason. And what we're kind of hoping is that this can sort of be used not just as a personal reflection tool, but potentially as something within your team or service that you can use to have more kind of critical conversations about generative AI and how it sort of impacts on your work. What we're hoping to do kind of moving forward is have this set up as part of a chatbot. So, for example, I'm just going to go back to share screen really quickly. And kind of moving forward, ideally want to have something like this where actually it's built into a chatbot. So this is kind of the custom chatbot feature I was talking about earlier, where basically you can kind of program these things with your own data, and it will kind of create a bit of a quiz for you based on the information that you provide. And you can then answer those quiz questions and come out with a specific spirit animal in kind of either the image of what's kind of created on the system or one of the kind of preset images that we have. So this is something we're hoping to kind of create sort of moving forward. Unfortunately, you can't use it at the moment because it's a little bit, as Laura's kind of said in there, like the Myers-Briggs type indicator, but with less of the neuroscience behind it. But the other problem is that GPTs at the moment are only available on the paid for version of ChatGPT. And that is another problem we haven't come to, is the digital poverty side, which we talked about last time. So all we've got at the moment is the PDF version. You answer those 4 questions that we've just done on the Mentimeter, and then you'll find out which of those 16 animal types you are. And really keen to find out, once we send those through, where you find yourself sitting and whether you feel that this kind of way of talking about or discussing generative AI in the workplace is useful for you. If so, why? If not, why not? And hopefully will be something that can maybe inform some of the conversations you're having moving forward. So I'll send all of that out in the presentation and as a kind of resource after we finish the session today. But just before we finish, because I appreciate we're rapidly running out of time, just really want to kind of finish by talking about how you might move forward with all of this, moving on from kind of today's session. So one of the big things that we've kind of talked about a little bit today, and I think is really important when it comes to that idea of using AI in work, is what is the problem we're trying to solve? And importantly, is AI the answer? And in order to do that, we've given one example today of kind of that reflective framework, of the foresee framework, but actually, you know, there are plenty of other ways that you might choose to discuss this. And this question, I think, is probably the most important one of all that's come back from people in the Mentimeter, in the chat, and through various conversations. You know, what is the problem we're trying to solve? Is AI the right answer to help us solve it, or are we using it just because it's there? And as we've said, there are so many different functions that people are using AI for at the moment, whether it's idea generation, content creation, creating those digital video twins. It's almost dizzying how many things we can use it for. But the question still remains, what's the why behind that? Why are we actually using it? And I'll just finish kind of on this point from Dr. Nima Pasha. So I've included a link to the video on the slides. This is from her talk at the Employability Lab 2023 conference. She sort of finished talking about ethical AI by saying, really, when we mention about ethical AI, what we're talking about is having a technology that allows humans to stay in human roles and perhaps using AI to augment those human roles in an effective way. But also remembering, as kind of Julie and a couple of other people have mentioned that today, all of this technology is trained on data that we have provided. So any of our biases, any of our assumptions are going to be baked into these things until there's a way to bake them out, if there ever is. So whatever we're kind of using, that criticality, returning to those ethical AI principles from the university or through other frameworks, is naturally going to be super, super important to us. So what I'm going to share in the resources that I send out after the session, but you can scan on your phone now if you want to, is I'm going to share a version of the 4C framework that I've just kind of talked about today. I'm going to share all the information about the generative AI spirit animals. And what I would kind of encourage everyone to do, if you have the time or if you feel it's useful, is consider how your current position and what you come out as on this kind of quiz and your general kind of perspective on AI might influence your own work and career development now and in the future. And of course, this is only a starting point, and we're hoping to do more of these kind of training sessions and different training sessions like this moving forward. So I'm just going to kind of return to Mentimeter before we finish. If you do need to get off, I appreciate we have just moved past past. So if you're having to dash, that's not a problem. If not, and you're happy to kind of stay on just to quickly answer 2 very quick Mentimeters for us, that would be really useful, just to kind of capture one word that you would use to describe today's session, and then one thing that you're planning to take away from today's session. And I'll just pop those up on screen in a second. If you've got time to fill those in, that would be really useful. And if not, and you do need to head off, then not a problem. Okay, Julie, can you see that okay? Is that coming through?
Yeah, that's coming through.
Wonderful. So yeah, this our last kind of thing really. If you've got kind of just 30 seconds to share with us on the Mentimeter, one word that you'd use to describe today's session. Yeah, I do. It has been quite a lot of content packed in. That's good feedback for our next session. So do kind of share on here. If there's anything, again, if it's something that is positive, negative, we don't mind. Really like to know kind of what you've got from today. And in a second, I'll skip over to the next Mentimeter, where we'll be asking you for just one takeaway, a little bit longer, in terms of what you might take from the session and use within your own context. Brilliant. So yeah, thanks for those who are sharing. Again, do put anything in the chat if you're not able to use Mentimeter for any reason. Yeah, I think interesting to kind of see people sort of leaning into sort of different descriptors here. But yeah, rapid whirlwind, I think that maybe describes the presentation style. If so, we have packed a lot in, so I do apologise. But also, I guess, also kind of describes where we're at with the topic at the moment as well. Things are moving extremely quickly with generative AI, perhaps kind of indicative of how much we've kind of put into this session. So yeah, thank you for sort of sharing feedback on that side. And again, there's a mixture here of both kind of positive, but also, I guess, as someone's kind of put there, anxiety inducing. We are in that position at the moment where things are moving very quickly. There's lots of stuff like Julie's mentioned around kind of ethical responses, where actually it's not entirely clear how that will be resolved, or if it will be resolved on a global basis. So I think those sort of feelings are perfectly natural and yeah, really useful to share as well. So final thing from us, if you could share just in this Mentimeter one thing that you'll take away from today's session. Could be a piece of information, could be some knowledge that you've gained, could just be a general sense of how you might move forward with generative AI. If you could share that with us, that would be really useful. And again, we will be able to share that in the slides afterwards so that you've got other people's responses as well. Yeah, so yeah, really nice to kind of just see some feedback already, whether it's about using specific tools or whether it's just kind of a sense of maybe how I might move forward with it. So a couple of people there have mentioned confidence to try it out a little bit more, maybe test that apprehension. Someone's mentioned there about maybe talking to your line manager about perhaps where they might use AI moving forward within their role, or kind of considerations. Yeah, thanks for that feedback on the left-hand side. Actually, this is really important. So, and this kind of helps for sort of future training sessions if we've maybe had a little bit too much content in here. The idea behind the 2 sessions, just for a bit of context, was the first session we did was supposed to be a little bit more of a foregrounding of where we're up to with AI. The second session was meant to be a little bit more advanced. So that may not have been as clear perhaps on the information on the pod site. So that's really good feedback for me to go back and check that. But also perhaps for future sessions, whether we make them a little bit longer or we just condense the content a little bit more. So really appreciate you sharing that. That's really useful. And yeah, thanks very much for kind of people who, again, just sharing how you're planning to use it moving forward. I think this is a really important point here. Useful to help with tasks, but maybe not replace human input. I think that's kind of coming back kind of quite regularly. But also this idea of, being critically reflexive, and the fact that this is not a static position. The technology is changing, but also our position with the technology is kind of changing as well. And that's really important. And yeah, thank you. Yeah, appreciate the inclusion of criticality. Yes, we were really keen to kind of focus on that. I know there's quite a lot of stuff around the ethics side that we've not been able to cover, but hopefully the 4C framework side was kind of designed to get people thinking that, yes, it's okay to be critical. And I think you're absolutely right. There can sometimes be too much gung-ho enthusiasm around new technology without the necessary kind of critique. So yeah, thank you to everyone who's kind of shared that. Really, really appreciate it. And I'm just seeing in the chat as well. Yeah, Heather's AI'd her face. Julie, you can give a comment on that if you want, and how that compares to your own AI'd face.
Yeah, I can see, because it always sort of plumps up your skin, and like it's almost what you'd have done, you know, if you went and had either like some cosmetic work done on your face, where it tries to like make you look smoother and younger and like flatter, and sort of it just does something weird.
Yeah, and I think, like you said, Juliet, that probably speaks to a lot of the values that are almost pre-programmed into it about, you know, conventional beauty standards. Why would you want to change your face? What would it change it to? So I think really interesting. You mentioned that right at the beginning. I appreciate we've run over. So just to kind of finish really briefly, if you do want to watch the previous session, which was a year of AI, where are we now? That is on the podcast YouTube channel. And this recording will also be put on the YouTube channel over the next kind of few days. Moving forward, I'm going to kind of share via my email address the session recording, the slides, and the recording slides from the previous workshop. If you've got any questions about it, feel free to drop me an email. Feel free to kind of engage with me on LinkedIn or Twitter/X. Very happy to kind of continue having conversations about all of this sort of stuff. So thank you very much for joining us today. I will stop the recording there. I'm happy to hang on for sort of another 5 minutes or so if anyone's got any questions. And again, massive thank you for joining us. If you've got any feedback, positive or negative, very, very happy to hear it either now or on the pod evaluation that you'll get sent. But if not, have a wonderful evening and we'll catch up with you soon.
Thanks.